Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, now I'll try again. Good morning, everyone. So let me see, is this Woodstock or a classroom? I can't imagine all the things I need to do to keep with Eric's vision of Woodstock, but who knows? We'll find out. First off, I just should say this might sound perfunctory, but it actually isn't in this particular setting. I am really, really honored to be included in this conference. I'm not an expert educator in the same sense that an awful lot of the people who are, the many presenters here are. I think I know most of what I know about schools in two capacities, neither of which is as a, quote, expert, that is as a participant and as a parent. As most of you know, probably clear from Barbara's introduction, I spend most of my time working businesses, but particularly not in the businesses, but trying to foster a degree of collaboration amongst many people in many different kinds of business organizations, trying to sustain deep and what we often call profound change, by which we mean change which is both deeply personal and deeply systemic. One of the paradoxes of understanding the world from a systems perspective is that those actually are two sides of the same coin. I think Carl Rogers, I actually think, said this first many years ago. He said, that which is most personal is most universal. And in a very interesting way, that which is most systemic is most personal. And we can't really separate those. We have a tendency to think the system's out there, you know, particularly when we're not feeling too well, particularly when things aren't going too well, particularly when we feel frustrated, discouraged, maybe downright despondent. You know, it's very easy to say, well, it's the system. You know, what can I do? What can we do? We're kind of like these little teeny weeny forces, you know, working against this massive thing called the system. Of course, no one can ever show you the system. Right? Like if a little kid came along and said, wow, that's like really impressive, you know, so the system is causing all this. Could you show it to me? It would be quite a challenge, right? I mean, like take them to the State Department of Education building and say, well, there it is. But of course the child would say, there what is? I see a building. Or you take them into, you know, the deliberations in the state senate and say, well, see, here's where kind of policy decisions are made. What do you mean policy decisions? You know, I thought you were going to show me the system. Or you take them down to some kind of row between parents and local politicians around something or other that has gotten some people really upset and unsettled, some innovation or other in the local schools. And you can just feel the kind of enormous forces pulling things back to where they used to be. And you could say, you see there, that's the system. And the kid would say, gee, I see some people who don't seem to be listening to one another. There's a real simple notion of system, which is kind of the cornerstone of what I've learned about this subject of systemic change. And that is, when we say the word the system, what we really are talking about, although we usually don't know how to talk about it very rigorously, is a pattern of interdependency that we enact. There is no system. It's purely an abstraction. But there are patterns of interdependency, and they're created every day, every hour, every minute, through our thinking and through our actions. So as Carl Rogers said, what is most universal is most personal, what is most systemic is most intimate. Just sort of leave those kind of thoughts on the side for a moment or two, maybe come back to them. I thought if there was anything that I ought to share with you, just a little bit kind of reflections on my experiences over the past 20 or 25 years. Again, primarily in the world of business. I feel a little more comfortable starting off with that because I think one of the things that I can offer here is what I've lived through, just as what each of us can offer is what we've lived through, as opposed to our ideas. And then based on that, perhaps there are some interesting implications for what we are all, in a sense, collectively trying to live into, which is the creation of something. I'm just going to, for want of knowing what the heck to call it, a post-industrial theory and practice of education. It's been about 20 or 25 years since there began to be some, I would say, critical mass of serious thinking and practice around understanding and transforming the systemic nature of business organizations. I've had it seems like an ever-expanding circle of friends and colleagues that really, kind of the initiating efforts, the first major projects go back about 20 or 25 years. And it's been organizing itself around a few simple ideas. I'm going to just say a word or two about this. I think a lot of these ideas are familiar to a lot of you, but they might be completely unfamiliar to others. So I just want to say a word or two just so we're all kind of starting at the same place. There is a kind of drumbeat to the industrial age. And the drumbeat is that the world is a fragmented set of pieces. This is the easiest to see when we realize that in some sense the industrial age has to continually and repeatedly, and you might say viciously, reinforce individualism. Because the essence of the economics of the industrial age has been to continually try to convince people of one overarching belief, one overarching worldview. Because if you don't continually convince people of this, if you don't work at it relentlessly, without interruption, some have argued the best organized religious enterprise in the history of humankind has been driving again and again and again one single message over and over again. And you encounter this message somewhere between 8 and 16 hours a day. You, me, everybody. The message is, whatever you've got is not enough. And there's two key notions there. Obviously, the not enough part, because after all, if you had this, you would have something you don't have now, and then, by golly, you would really be happy. But the other part is, of course, the you. The you is a very particular you. The you is an isolated individual, a consumer, whatever word you want. I had the opportunity to do a lot of work in southern Africa in the latter part of the 80s and early 90s. And one of the things that was very wonderful for me in that experience was encountering a different you that was still central. We have no idea the extent to which industrialization destroys this you. And the you I'm talking about now is not an isolated individual. One of my good friends there was an internal consultant, worked with actually the largest corporation in South Africa, a large electrical utility. I believe at the time, probably still today, the largest organization in the continent, on the continent of Africa. In quite an extraordinary time period. This was the 1980s. This is before apartheid was being unwound. And this is an organization, obviously, that's run by whites. And yet the CEO at that time, quite a remarkable man named Ian McRae, got really captivated by some of the basic ideas of quality management. And he started to understand that one of the cornerstones of quality management were teams, were people really learning together. And that this really was crucial to innovation and building the kind of organization he really dreamed of building. That he had to create a real ethic and capacity for collaboration. And he did something quite remarkable starting around 1984 or 1985. He created, along with the gentleman that I was talking about my friend Louis van der Meuve, an internal team of consultants, organization change consultants, almost all of whom were black, working in this white organization. Louis told me a story, he told me many stories about what it was like working that team, which turned out over the long term to be extraordinarily effective. But he said, you know, there were a lot of real deep learnings along the way. And one of them, he said, came at one of our first meetings. And we had a kind of team meeting of the group of consultants. And after the meeting, I noticed one of the fellas, Joseph, was really, really down. And I went over to Joseph. I said, Joseph, what's the matter? And he said, well, didn't you see what happened? He said, no, I don't understand. What do you mean? Well, didn't you see what happened? Did you remember when I said about the team I'm working with and the challenge and the difficulty and what I'm up against? And like, nobody said anything. And Louis said, oh, Joseph, I'm really sorry. You know, I mean, obviously that's not polite. We should have acknowledged what you said. It was very important. I think we all heard it. But, you know, the meeting was going very fast, and we jumped down to the next person's comments. And Joseph said, no, Louis, you do not understand. They do not make me a person. In Joseph's culture, a human being only exists in relationship. That is what a human being is. A human being exists in relationship. Oh, there's a body thing over here. There's obviously separation. There's, you know, a person thing over there and a person thing over there, but it's actually not a human being. A human being, a you, never exists in isolation. And even the people in that world would have difficulty saying that, because to construct the words the way I just constructed, you have to kind of look at it from the outside in, because that's who they are. They are human beings in relationship. Eric mentioned the Fifth Discipline Field Book. There's a little passage at the beginning which was really nice to share with people. Is a different story, not that same story. But it starts off with the Zulu greeting. The equivalent of hello in Zulu is I see you. Now that's not actually unique to Africa. That seems to be almost universal amongst indigenous peoples around the world. This deep notion of relatedness to one another, to nature, to life. In fact, it would be quite kind of inconceivable to people in indigenous cultures to think that you can have kind of happiness by getting stuff. So that middle leg of the stool about reflectiveness is not just, you know, well, you know, what's my assumption here about kids? It's really at whatever level, the deeper and deeper and deeper we can go as how is it that we're making sense of our reality? And an old joke, you know, that it's hard to know what fish talk about, but you can be damn sure it ain't water. This is the water we live in. My favorite definition of culture, the one I learned from Ed Schein, a longtime colleague at MIT, long, long ago, he said, culture are the assumptions we cannot see. Culture are the assumptions we cannot see. So what we gradually came to understand through that middle leg of the stool is there are a set of deep, remarkably pervasive assumptions underlying the industrial age. Let me just talk for a minute about the third leg of the stool, because I didn't want to come back and kind of go much further with that last comment. But I just want to complete the background. The third leg of the stool just says aspiration. I think maybe the A got lost there. I didn't get it quite set, but you can kind of imagine. You could call it, it could just be an IN, it could be inspiration, but it's actually aspiration. So I'll put it real simply. Dr. Deming used to have a very simple way of saying this. He used to say, our prevailing system of management has destroyed our people. By the way, with all the hullabaloo about quality management and the quality revolution, of course, what most people quickly lost was what it was actually all about, and quickly became a set of tools and techniques and quality circles and you know what. And I actually was once at a panel with Dr. Deming with a group of educators. And the whole meeting was actually most of the state heads of the state departments of education. The whole meeting was about quality management and education. And when Deming listened to what people were actually talking about, what they were doing, he was appalled. It was the antithesis of what he stood for. I'll never forget him looking at that group of, people really excited and all the great stuff they were doing in quality management and education. He said, "You have no idea that you are attempting to apply for the revitalization of America's education system, the system of management which has destroyed American enterprise." And you're calling it quality management. And by that you mean measure, incent, drive standards through the system. By the way, that literally was being called quality management. I mean, you probably know better than me. Years ago, I remember hearing Dr. Deming say, actually, he wrote this went on the back chapter of the first printings of the fifth discipline. I always was really appreciative. He said, "Our prevailing system of management has destroyed our people." I always thought that, I kind of said it all. The destruction starts with toddlers. Gold stars, grades in school, a prize for the best Halloween costume. The destruction continues on up through university and into work, where people are ranked, reward for the one at the top, punishment for the one at the bottom. Management by objectives, incentive pay, business plans cause further loss, unknown and unknowable. What I'd like to do is kind of keep center that little phrase of his, our prevailing system of management, because I have really one primary thing to share with you, and what I've been saying up to now is really kind of background to hopefully get us going and get us thinking together. I really always like to acknowledge Dr. Deming for this point, because I learned it from him, that actually school and work are the same institution. There's no difference. They are simply two embodiments of the industrial age system of management. And my hope is, by the end of the short time we have this morning, that will start to make a little sense to you. Maybe for many of you it already makes a lot of sense. The reason I think it's important is that until we start to see that, we don't begin to feel this water. We don't begin to get a sense of how deep this set of assumptions and practices which have characterized the growth of the industrial age are. And we have no clue what it actually means to try to bring about truly systemic or deep or profound change. All of our efforts are on the surface until we see how deeply these assumptions penetrate. Now, interestingly, I've found for many years, talking to people in business, that it's actually the easiest way to get started is to ask them about their experiences as school children. It's really interesting. First off, it's a common experience for all of us. We all went to the same school. Well, there might be a few of us here who went to a different school, but probably not many. My guess is you went to the same school I went to. And we all learn the same lessons quickly. I'm almost a little hesitant to kind of talk about this here, because I suspect most of you here have thought about this deeply. But for what it's worth, it's enormously helpful. I've found again and again that people in business go, wow, I never thought about that. And then all of a sudden they quickly realize, oh my gosh, look what we're doing in our company. By the way, did you know about learning before you went to school? So clearly we didn't learn about learning in school. We wouldn't have got to school if we hadn't already been masters of learning, because this was one of Deming's kind of deep insights, that human beings are born, as he said, with joy in learning. Nobody gives it to them. Nobody motivates them in it. They don't have to acquire that from any place. The two cornerstones of Deming's philosophy was human beings are born with intrinsic motivation and joy in learning. I remember years ago reading a little piece by Edward Hall. Some of you may have heard of Edward Hall. He's one of the eminent anthropologists of this era. And the piece was titled The Drive to Learn, and Hall made the argument I thought it was a very compelling argument, that the most fundamental drive in the human species is the drive to learn. He said it's clearly more fundamental than the drive to reproduce. Which, by the way, if you're dealing with teenagers, is a great conversation starter. Oh, yeah, right. Learning's more basic than sex. Sure, teach. I got it. But Hall made the argument that it's quite obvious that we come into the world fully engaged in learning. And there's no evidence whatsoever that a human being at any point in their life loses this drive to learn. Stradivarius made his most famous and exquisite violins in his 90s. Deming was leading his courses until literally the week before he passed away at 93. And you all can think of examples, you know, people who just inspire you. It's somehow in the age of 75 they take up playing the guitar or painting or you know what. Who cares? Unfortunately, while we come into life fully prepared for a lifetime of learning, we then start to encounter something quite different. We start to encounter industrial age institutions. Now, of course, you can argue that a lot of this goes on much earlier. A lot of this may be encountered at home, and certainly a lot of it's encountered in a lot of different ways through the immersion in the mass media of young children. But let's just forget about that for a second, because it's just so simple. And particularly for the kind of main point I want to share with you, it's so illuminating of this idea that school and work are fundamentally the same institution, to just reflect a little bit on what it is we all learned about how school works somewhere between the ages of 5 and 7. What did we learn about learning in school? You all know. I mean, there's a million different answers, but there's really a few that are kind of central. What are some of the things that all children learn quickly about how school really works? First off, is it about learning? No, absolutely not. It's about teaching, instruction, who knows, but that's all kind of abstract words for the kid. What's it really about? The kid picks this up pretty quickly, certainly first grade, second grade. Nowadays, if we have some success in our magical educational reform movements around America, then maybe they'll even pick it up in preschool. School is about performing for someone else's approval. Of course, kids have already learned this. They've been performers since they were born, right? So they've been performing for approval for a long time. So they pretty quickly pick up that school is like, this is the real performance. Oh, but because you say they know what learning is. They all know what learning is because they learn to walk, and they learn to talk, and they learned how to get things done in their family. They learned how to control a lot in their family, right? We all know who runs the show, right? And you tell me that's not a learning process? Any parent is totally, in reaction. They're almost their entire parenting to the learning process that's going on amongst their kids. Because their kids are learning to run the show. I mean, after all, how could, these little squirts who have no authority and are little tiny tykes totally control the household if there wasn't some kind of learning process going on? I mean, this is kind of obvious, right? But now they learned that there's a different game going on here. It's called performing. It's called, usually it comes down to really tangible things right away. What's some of the first things you can remember learning as a 6-year-old? What had happened in that schoolroom where you were kind of psyching out the rules of the game? What are the things that kind of struck you and said, oh, if I do that, I'm in big trouble? Like? Talk out of turn. Like getting out of line. Like, come on. Going to the bathroom without a pass. Looking off your friend's paper. We shoot collaborators here. I'm jumping ahead. I'm jumping to 2 institutions out, but you'll get back to that. How about answers? What did we learn as kids in school about answers? There's right answers and wrong answers. And by the way, which one's better? Right. Terrific. How do you actually learn? Really learn? No. That's the schoolroom learning. How do you really learn? Every kid knows how learning occurs. Every single child, every place in the world, by the age of 3, knows exactly how learning occurs. How does learning occur? You make lots of mistakes. But now all of a sudden I've been told learning is about getting right answers. Little problem here. And by the way, who has the right answers? How do you know when you've gotten them? He or she tells you. I mean, really, this is not complicated, gang. It's very clear what's going on here. Another thing I learned from Deming, and this was part of this same kind of, I thought, extraordinary insight. He said, the relationship between the student and the teacher is identically the same relationship between the subordinate and the boss. Think about it. Performing for someone else's approval. Who tells you when you've done it right? Who holds the key to your sense of accomplishment? It's really interesting. Probably a lot of you have kids who play video games. By the way, if you don't think the kids understand this whole system, you should pay a little closer attention. They understand the entire system. How many of you have ever seen any of the video games the kids play? Right? Any of them. Now, most video games, that's not many hands. Really? You've never seen the video games? Nintendos and Segas and all that? Wow. You really ought to spend a little time doing what the kids do, really. It is your profession. I spend a lot of time because I got kids. Now, almost all video games are organized by levels. By the way, all those same kids who sit there, like sluggards in school, seem to have totally no motivation, go home and have zero problem motivating themselves to go from level 1 to level 5 to level 10 to level 23, right? No one has to tell them they ought to. No one has to punish them if they don't make it. They just seem to naturally want to go from level 1 to level 5. I got level 5, let's go to level 10. Isn't that interesting? By the way, that was the leg of the stool that was called aspiration. We were all born with aspiration. Nobody motivates anybody, period, except through fear. Deming understood that deeply. Come back to that one. By the way, at each level, it's kind of standard terminology in the kids' worlds of video games, and it's often actually in the video game itself. At each level, you usually have to kind of kill somebody. There's a bit of violence that tends to be programmed into these video games. And it's usually some, big, ugly-looking dude, he's got tentacles and, And once you've killed that dude, you go on to the next level. That's pretty standard kind of design of video games. By the way, you know what the dude is called? Thank you. Did you hear what he said? The boss. You think they don't understand what's going on? So they spend their day having to perform for someone else's approval so they can go home in the afternoon and kill a lot of bosses. Prevailing system of management is not about learning, it's about control. Period. End of story. And it's a very particular notion of control. It's an industrial age notion of control. It's a system that's designed to control, putting the power in the hands of a small number of people who execute that control. By the way, control is a biological principle. This system is a system that in many ways is viable precisely because it has a capacity for self-control. In biology, it's called the principle of homeostasis, and it's characteristic of all organisms that live. They have some capacity to control things essential to their viability. But that's not the notion of control of the industrial age. The industrial age notion of control is something's going on out here and somebody over here has to be in control. Okay? Kids understand that completely. Okay. Let me just share a few things that I've also learned from hanging around the business world for the last 20 years. Really simple things, but it might be news to you. This is changing. It's not a simple change. In fact, I think as all really epochal changes, a change of epochs, this is a period of extraordinary cross-current. Most business corporations are basically pouring all the energy they can into sustaining, strengthening, tightening up, becoming yet more able to operate in the industrial mode. And there are exceptions, striking exceptions. Most people don't even pay attention to them. Do you know what the largest corporation in the world is? What kind of would you guess? And now, when I say large now, I mean in economic terms, the market value, typical kind of overarching measure of size. The largest corporation in the world in terms of market value. What would you guess? Microsoft, I heard somebody say. What else? AT&T, Ford, General Electric, Disney. None of those are within a factor of about 3. A corporation no one ever thinks of. By the way, of all ones you mentioned, General Electric has the largest market value presently in the U.S. But there's another corporation that has about 3 times the market value, 2.5, 3 times. These things, of course, fluctuate day by day. It has a market value at least 5 to 6 times that of Microsoft, and much bigger than all the other corporations you mentioned. But no one ever thinks of it. It's Visa International. Now you might say, gee, that's interesting, credit cards. That's a kind of a mixed bag as a business. I'm not here, I don't want to make a big deal about the credit card industry, but I do want to point out something that's a little known fact. Visa International has a market value of somewhere in the vicinity of $500 billion, about $500 billion, and it has 3,000 employees. That's why no one ever thinks of it. Visa International doesn't look like, feel like, or smell like a traditional industrial age corporation. 3,000 employees, almost $500 billion, between $400 and $500 billion market value, has 3,000 employees. Visa International is a network. Visa International is actually, in fact, governed by a constitution and elected boards, elected by its members. Visa International is a radical, democratic, decentralized system of governance. Visa International was created that way intentionally with one overarching aim, which was to build into the system the fundamental inability to concentrate power. Because the people who were kind of architecting this believed deeply from their experience in industrial age organizations, if you concentrate power, you'll kill innovation, you'll kill motivation, and of course, the other consequence is you'll concentrate wealth. You concentrate power, you concentrate wealth. So you simply, once again, refuel the inequity which is deeply designed into the industrial age system. 100 years ago, we implemented graduated income taxes in this country, in part to try to correct what was clearly developing in the early part of the industrial age to concentrate income and wealth. By the way, if you've looked at the statistics, you can get a little feeling of how successful this has been. I'm sorry, I'll probably goof this, so please take this as being in the ballpark, but roughly wrong. Somebody said yesterday that Bill Gates' accumulated wealth in the last decade exceeded that of about 98% of Americans in terms of net wealth gain. I don't know if that's literally the facts, but we know that it's in the ballpark. We know that about 5% or less of Americans accumulate almost all the wealth that's been accumulated in the last 10 years. But this is not new. This is just kind of a little tip of what's been a 100-year, 200-year process. As Dee Hock, who was the kind of architect and first CEO of Visa International, said, this company has made a lot of money, there's a lot of millionaires, but it cannot produce billionaires. It's not possible, because it simply does not concentrate power. Let me try another little tidbit out on you, because my point is just to kind of get you to see that actually something is happening in the world. Let's talk about the auto industry. Somebody mentioned Ford a minute ago. What would you guess? Now, you people aren't folks who spend your life in the auto industry, but, you buy cars, and we all know a little about the auto industry. What's the best auto company in the world? What do you think? Best quality product, loyalty of customer, and financial success. And by the way, there's one that's head and shoulders above everybody else. Toyota. The market capitalization of Toyota has roughly equaled the sum of the market capitalization of Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler for over 10 years, despite all the difficulties in Japan. Here's an interesting little tidbit, which I think If this wouldn't make educators sit up and take notice, I don't know what will. Because it gets at another kind of cornerstone to the DNA, I believe, of industrial age organizing. I've spent a lot of time with Ford. Ford's been a partner in our consortium we've been developing for over 10 years. We have great admiration for people at Ford. So I'd say this not as a criticism, but more as a reflection. I would get shown the door very quickly if I went into Ford's top management and told them what I'm going to tell you now, but it's actually fact. Toyota Motor Company, the preeminent auto company in the world, the company whose production process, the famous Toyota production process, every big auto company has been trying to copy for 10 years. No one has still gotten close to the levels of quality, reliability, and cost performance of the Toyota production system. And by the way, it has nothing to do with Japanese. The Toyota operations here in the US and other parts of the world are just as productive as they are any place in the world. It has nothing to do with who's working there. In the Toyota production system and in Toyota, there are no standardized measures for cost control. None. Zero. If you went to Ford and said, look, I found the key why you cannot reproduce the Toyota production system. It's because you're so busy measuring costs and using those to control what people do. They would say you're crazy. After all, this was the company of the whiz kids. These are the people who taught American industry how to control costs. You remember Robert McNamara and the famous whiz kids of the 50s. You can't conceive of the fact that if you're not measuring and using those measures to control the system, it can't possibly work. Toyota has no standardized system of cost control, none. It is impossible for management to try to control what goes on in the company through measuring what's going on and creating incentives to force people to accomplish the measures. Sound vaguely familiar? Do I need to be more heavy-handed? Now, in fact, in Toyota, they measure lots of stuff. Why? Because learners engaged in learning are continually curious about how they're doing. It's not that they don't measure. It's not that they're dummies. It's not that they don't know how to collect statistics. They simply don't organize the statistics and report them up to hierarchy so someone sitting up here can punish, to use Deming's term, someone down here for not performing. Because that would be, after all, obviously the antithesis of learning. That would be a system, as Deming said very clearly, that's trying to motivate people through fear. Now maybe you'll understand why Deming told those heads of the state departments of education, you are busy applying the system of management to revitalize American education, which has destroyed American industry. If you walk into the Toyota corporate headquarters in Toyota City in Japan, you'll see three big pictures on the wall. See Mr. Toyota, the founder, his son, Mr. Toyota, who ran the company for many years until recently, and a large portrait in the center. Guess whose portrait is sitting in the center? W. Edwards Deming. One of the few corporations who understood what he had to say. Human beings are born with joy in learning, dignity, self-respect, intrinsic motivation. Our system of organizing and managing of the industrial age has destroyed our people, quote. It has nothing to do with school. It has nothing to do with business. It has to do with a common set of assumptions and practices which are everywhere. Speaking as a person who lives in business, I'm going to tell you, most business people, managers would say, well, my gosh, I'm going to be totally irresponsible if I'm not out there measuring costs and motivating my people, right? First rule of management is your job is to motivate, right? And what do people pay attention to? You know these old saws that probably have their counterparts in education. People pay attention to what we measure. It's the kind of cardinal rules of management. Got a holy trinity of industrial age managing, organizing, planning, controlling. It is a pickle we're in. I mean, it really is. The deeper you realize how far down these assumptions go, the more and more you realize that almost everything we try to do to bring about change, is just up here. moving stuff around. Eric's comment, you know, the reorganizing, the restructuring. I mean, you don't have this problem only. Heck, I've been around companies who've reorganized 4 times in the last year. And I'll tell you, I've gotten very cynical about it. I don't know if this would apply as much in education, but it might. I kind of come to the conclusion, I think I understand why companies reorganize so much. It's really pretty simple. It's not complicated at all. There's actually very few things a CEO can do. And I mean it sincerely. Here's a person who really feels a sense of responsibility for the health of their organization. They're trying to get the organization to change and adapt to a world they see is really changing all around them. And they got to do something, right? Got to do something. So what do? They hire new people, they fire people, senior people usually. They create programs, make speeches and create these change programs they roll out. And they reorganize. What else can they do? They don't design products, they don't produce products, they don't deal with customers. So I don't know, maybe that's relevant to you as well. There's one large story I'll share with you from the business world. And I say this because, you know, these kind of stories aren't usually get out, because most of what we read in the press, in my estimation, is story after story after story of the re-strengthening the industrial age model. But partly because the people who write the stories don't know exactly what to look for. I mean, believe me, I've read a lot about Toyota, and I never, ever knew that. And it's not widely known at all, and I only happen to know what I shared with you because a man named Tom Johnson, who's world famous in the field of accounting, he invented something called activity-based costing, a radical, different view of the essence and practice of accounting, has spent 5 years living in Toyota. And that's the only reason I know. He's seen something that nobody else could see. Because they're all measuring stuff. But he finally realized they have no reporting hierarchy to use those measures. They can only be used by the people in the process themselves. Which, of course, makes all the sense in the world, as I said, because they want to learn. They want to do things better. So they have to have some way of knowing how they're doing. This was, of course, the huge problem with assessment in education. You know, we kind of go between extremes. On the one hand, we go, well, this is terrible. You know, everybody's judging and evaluating each other, and you've got a system based on fear. But on the other hand, if you have no assessing, you have no learning. No human being can learn anything without being able to make sense of how well they've progressed relative to their aspirations, right? You all know that. I don't have to belabor that with you. Obviously, the distinction is who's doing the assessing. And if learners are getting more and more capable to do their own assessing, by golly, it'll accelerate their learning. We have a few environmental problems, by the way. One last little glitch with the industrial age model. It's destroyed our people and it's destroying our world. Other than that, no big problem. And we all know that. We all know that there are deep problems with the consequences of industrialization, particularly as it continues to spread globally in the world. 26,000 species vanished last year. You know, we go, oh, well, big deal, you know. Species, what's that all about? Well, it's obvious that's the gene pool. You know, that's the essence of evolution. And you know, you've all heard whatever statistics you've heard and concluded about the consequences of our activities in the environment. There's an interesting company based in Georgia named Interface. Probably not many of you have ever heard of it, but it's the largest manufacturer in the world of commercial carpeting, the kind of stuff we're sitting on. And they have very interesting business vision. I happen to know the company pretty well. They're also part of this consortium that I mentioned to you before, which we call the Society for Organization Learning. Eric mentioned that, or excuse me, Barbara mentioned that in the bio. Interface has a really interesting vision. Their vision is to never sell another carpet. You might say, well, that's a kind of curious vision for a company that's in the business of the largest supplier of commercial carpeting in the world. Well, their vision is to only rent carpets and to achieve 100% recycling. Because after all, you and I actually don't care about the carpet. We care about the feeling under our feet. We care about the feeling in the room that a nice carpet can bring. We care about the consequence. We don't care about the stuff. By the way, where does your car go when you get rid of it, and the person you sold it to gets rid of it, and the person you sold it to gets rid of it? Xerox has just brought out a new copier. It's doing extraordinarily well in the market. extraordinarily well. It's a large copier system. It's industrial strength. It's not the kind of copier you would buy in your home. Probably some schools might buy it, I guess, real systems. In any case, the interesting thing about this Xerox new copier is it's 97% recyclable. The previous model that it replaced, took them 7 years to develop this, had 2,000 parts. This has 200 parts. They all snap together. A technician can come out and do any kind of repair work on this copier with a single tool, because it has only one mechanical adjustment. It's a fully digitized copier system. And the vision of the people who created it was, in a word, this was their phrase, zero to landfill. Zero to landfill. They didn't succeed. They got to 97%. I won't tell you how much money Xerox saves from this. It's vastly less expensive to remanufacture a copier than to produce it from scratch. Not to mention the fact that 3% goes to landfill. And they'll get to zero. It can be done. It's not an engineering limit. We could all be driving cars that were somebody else's car before. It's quite feasible. And I guarantee you, many companies are starting to get very serious about it. Honda's going to introduce a car this year, which all the big companies are trying to kind of race down the line. It's called a hybrid. It will get about, I think, 60 or 70 miles to the gallon, but that same technology could easily get 200 miles a gallon. It's a totally new concept of how to combine internal combustion, electricity, and passive systems. You know when you drive your car, this is the engineer in me, excuse me for just a minute. You know when you drive your car, where about 96% of the energy goes? You know, obviously it comes in through the gasoline and the internal combustion process. You know where about 96% of it goes? It's lost as heat in braking. No one ever thought about capturing that heat, because that's energy, storing it in some fashion, so it could be used to move the car. Except the hybrid does that with a huge flywheel that stores energy and the car's braking. So I'm just kind of, look at, the point of all this is I'm trying to get you to begin realizing that, yep, it's a really tough challenge we face, but there's some interesting stuff going on. The fundamental problem is the more this interesting stuff goes on, the more the traditional system will rear up its heels and fight to maintain its viability. And by the way, the traditional system is us. It's not them. It's all the assumptions we've never examined. It's all the fears we have with a schoolroom that might be out of control. Believe me, if you listen to Dee Hock's story about the first 10 years of Visa, it's hilarious. I mean, they had just battle after battle because the managers couldn't imagine how an organization could work without somebody in control. Let me kind of cut to one kind of final point. And I think I'm going to pause for a little bit because I'd like to kind of hear how some of this is striking you. A very simple way to summarize a lot of little bits and pieces I've been trying to share with you is, again, in the spirit of deep reflection, to kind of look at what really, why is it that industrial age institutions seem to have so much in common? See, Deming did an extraordinary service by pointing to the fact that school and work are not fundamentally different in the way the system of management, as he would say, works. There's obviously a question that brings to the surface. Why? How did it get to be this way? After all, most of the people who spend their lives in the field of education do not spend their lives in work. There's not a huge amount of crossing back and forth. There is some, obviously, disgruntled teachers at the age of 28 who give up and go to work in a high tech, and obviously, but there's not a huge amount of crossing back and forth. Certainly no one has organized this. No one holds, I mean, have you been to a conference lately with managers from industry and administrators from school, and the purpose of the conference is to teach you the industrial age system of managing? Right? I mean, it's like a big organized effort. I mean, when you think about it, it's incredibly successful. We have propagated a system of managing around the world. And gradually, the industrial age school model propagates around the world, just as the industrial age organizational model propagates around the world. So this is a heck of an effort. You could hardly rack this up to accident. Right? As they say, if something keeps happening again and again and again, it's probably not random. What's going on? It must be in the water. I'm certainly not the first one to point in this general direction, but it seems to me that if we really ask ourselves, how is it that our system of managing in schools, and when I say managing, I mean really organizing and managing, the whole 9 yards, system of managing in schools and work are so profoundly similar? How does this come to be? And as I've thought about that since over the last 10 years, since I first heard Deming say that, it's come around to a really simple idea. And I don't think it's anything new or radical. It's probably something that maybe some of you have thought about as well. It comes back to the subject of culture, and particularly the way that organizing metaphors can permeate a culture. Again, this is the water. It's extraordinarily difficult for us to see the organizing metaphors that give coherence and common meaning to our lives. But I do believe if you look at the history of the industrial age, it's extraordinarily, kind of jumps out at you that there is an incredible metaphor that has organized the industrial age. What is it? Thank you. The woman in front said, the machine. Many people have called it the machine age. Think about it. There's certain characteristics of a machine, very basic characteristics of a machine. A machine has a design purpose or a function, right? How do you know it functions well? It produces certain consistent outputs. By the way, if you turned on your computer and every time, it gave you a different screen to look at, you wouldn't be too happy about that, would you? So a machine has to consistently produce certain outputs, right? It has to produce a degree of uniformity. A cornerstone of the machine image is the aspiration for uniformity. It's designed into the metaphor. If one day you turned your car this way with the wheel and it went left, and the next day you turned it this way and it went right, you would not consider it a great car. What else can we say about machines? What can you say about control in machines? Efficiency is terribly important in any design of a machine. There's all kinds of different aspects of efficiency. And what about control? Doesn't a machine control itself? Of course not. A good machine, a well-designed machine, is easily controllable, right? By a controller or controllers. It does what the controllers want it to do, consistently. By the way, does the machine create itself? Or did it have builders, designers, who built it so that it could be controllable by the controllers to produce a certain uniformity of output? Isn't this obvious? Does it start to sound familiar? Look it. If there has ever been an organization in the industrial age that looks, feels more like an assembly line than school, show it to me. It's so obviously patterned after the assembly line. I mean, after all, why does everybody have to start at 5 and why do they have to end at 18? What's so magic about that? Oh, yeah, it's all been determined, research on development. At the age of 18, every human being is ready to go out and go to work, right? Right, sure. Or at the age of 5 or 6, they're exactly all ready for the exact same thing to start happening to them. So they can then move to the next step at the same time, and then the next step at the same time. Why is it organized in these darn discrete steps? Where do you think that idea came from? By the way, what do we call people who can't move at the pace of the machine? Yeah, the fancy term, learning impaired, right? The traditional term, stupid. Right? Where did this whole idea of stupidity in terms of pace of learning come from? Because you either fit on a machine or you didn't. I'd hate to say this to a group like this, but you all know that many people of extraordinary genius do not learn at the same speed, right? Before I ever read any of the books or learned about theories of multiple intelligence or any of that stuff, I'll never forget going for a hike 20 geez, that was 25 years ago. My wife and I were on a summer hiking trip in the Alps. That's funny. And we came upon an older Hungarian couple. And we hiked together for the afternoon till we got to a hut where we spent the evening. Turned out this gentleman had worked with Niels Bohr. Now, Niels Bohr, of course, one of the most famous physicists of the 20th century. Niels Bohr was probably the initial architect of the quantum theory. Niels Bohr also had a world-famous institute in Copenhagen. And if you were a young theoretical physicist in the 20s or into the 30s, even before they finally kind of wound down in the 30s with the growth of Nazism, there was no greater kind of feather in your cap than to be able to go to Niels Bohr's institute in Copenhagen. This guy we were hiking with in 1970 as a young man had gone to Niels Bohr's institute in Copenhagen. So he was telling me what it was like. And we were talking, and he was telling great stories. Of course, all the famous, virtually every well-known physicist of the era would pass through Niels Bohr's institute in Copenhagen. And then he told me something which I've never forgotten. He said, you know, in fact, most of the young hotshot theoreticians who came to Bohr's institute didn't really think he was that bright. You know, these were like the Olympic athletes of their educational systems. You know, their minds moved at the speed of light. He said they would always contradict the fifth conclusion of your argument when you'd only laid out this third premise. Because they could see exactly where you were going. And Bohr kind of sat there. He didn't seem to have a real kind of love of this kind of extraordinary intellectual, and anyone who's ever been in an environment that you know exactly what I mean, this kind of intellectual jousting. He just didn't, they didn't think he was very bright. And I'll never forget what he then said. It stayed with me for 25 years. He said, you know, but when he understood, he really understood. He said, but you know, when he understood, he really understood. We've substituted speed of reasoning for understanding. Why? Because the assembly line is about regularity, speed. Oh, by the way, if the assembly line's not quite working well enough, what's your most natural reaction? Try to speed it up. What's going on in the world everywhere today? Things being speeded up. Right? Anybody here work longer than they did 10 years ago? More hours? Notice their life being speeded up? So, I offer it as a ponderable. Might it not be that we're caught up in a myth? I don't mean myth in the sense, any of the kind of the sense that it's always meant to culturalists. A kind of set of assumptions, a way of seeing the world, which has given great coherence and been very successful. Its only small problem is it's destroyed our people and destroying our environment. And we're all part of it. By the way, Tom Johnson, the man I mentioned to you who spent the last 5 years in Toyota, is quite famous as an accounting theorist. He said, I finally understand now what Toyota had to go through and what they've kind of come to some collective understanding of over the last 30 years. He said, see, the basic problem is nature doesn't quantify. Nature does not quantify. It's a really interesting point. You will not find 98.6 any place in nature. It's clearly a human artifact. What nature seems to do is cultivate a deeper and deeper appreciation of pattern or awareness. Literally, what you might say nature's model for intelligence is nothing but awareness of the richer and richer diversity of what's going on here, now, where I stand. Numerical quantification, quantifiable measures, an invention of the Western culture particularly, and Galileo specifically. An extraordinary accelerator on Western scientific progress. But it's a human artifact. That doesn't mean it's bad. As I say, Toyota measures stuff. But you know what? The measuring is secondary to the learning. They seem to have the cart and horse in the right respective positions. But in the industrial age, believe me, what you measure is real. Because after all, the machine controls itself and is controllable by its operators by having a little thing there that says you're going 68, 69, 75, oh, I better slow down. See, it's an industrial age artifact. So isn't it amazing? I mean, it's truly astounding if you think about it. After somewhere around, between a couple 100,000 and maybe a million years or so, we've managed to almost begin to convince a species that what's most real is what's most measurable. Except there is that few hundreds of thousands of years that predates the industrial era. And it's still with us, and it's still in us, and we absolutely know that no one will ever measure love. And if they do, we really don't care much, because the number is really quite paltry in comparison to the experience. And that we'll never measure inspiration, and we'll never measure persistence, and we'll never measure... Oh, we can create measures, but creating measures and the phenomenon itself are two different creatures. So we've got ourselves in a bit of a pickle. We've gotten better and better at doing what nobody ultimately wants to do. Shortly before he died, a physicist who had a big impact on me, a man named David Bohm, put together a little book with a photojournalist. And it was David's writings. David was a preeminent quantum theorist of the second half of the 20th century, really quite remarkable man. There's Einstein and Bohr, if you know a little bit about the history, really got further and further apart. They could not really communicate because the quantum theory and the relativity theory were in some ways not reconcilable at that point in time. Bohm was the person who Einstein said was the only person who ever helped him understand the quantum theory when David was a young professor at Princeton. Near the end of his life, he put together this little book with a photojournalist. And it's called Changing Consciousness. And they just went around the world. David wrote his text, his reflections on what we're understanding about reality and the frontiers of physics, which is it ain't what it used to be. It's not what's out there. And there's been remarkable parallels in the frontiers of physics and the frontiers of biology to lead us to see that human beings, all living beings, participate in life. They don't observe life and construct their meaning. And in fact, as Bohm used to say, thought shapes reality. And that might sound like a bit of metaphysics to you, but this is a preeminent physics theorist. Anyhow, I always remember that book because they took pictures of people all around the world and just juxtaposed them with David's prose. And it really is a very powerful experience. You see all these people walking through shopping malls and standing next to their huts. You see people from all around the world and all different kind of conditions of living in the world today. And something starts to hit you as you look through these pictures and you read the text. You realize that all the people in the shopping malls really aren't smiling very much. And the people standing outside their huts have smiles from ear to ear. Now, I'm not romanticizing, please. We're not going to go back to living as hunter-gatherers, but I do think actually tribal organizing has been with us for tens of thousands of years, and I don't suspect it's going away. That's another subject for another time. But it's what we're up against. And Deming, by the way, said one other thing. This is kind of in some ways a whole morning as a tribute to him. I think it's appropriate. He said we have to go upstream. It's totally inadequate to concentrate our efforts on the corporate world. Because the corporate world is downstream from the more formative processes which are upstream. The last several years of his life, he said again and again, and this was what was so frustrating to him about seeing his message be completely turned 180 degrees, that really, if we don't start to focus on reinventing the processes of education, there's no hope. And you know that, and I know that. We have to go upstream. I share one last little practical tip from our experience and kind of what's involved in helping organizations sustain this kind of change. We started using this term learning organization about 10, 12 years ago. It seemed to kind of work. The work on systems thinking, on reflectiveness, on aspiration, that goes back 20, 30, 40 years. But it was a nice kind of organizing idea. I come to the conclusion now that it probably was also off a little bit. It was kind of pointing in the right direction, but after 10 years, I still haven't seen one, you know? Like I was joking to you about before, show me the system, as a child would say. It's an abstraction. It's an invention. It was undoubtedly useful. It may still continue to be useful. But I've also seen an awful lot of companies, and I had to say a few schools, kind of go a little bit down the wrong path, wanting to become a learning organization. Probably one of the most powerful insights, I would say it's really hit me from this last 10 years, is realizing that there is a deep rhythm that transforms institutions. I do think this is possible. I've seen enough evidence of it. All the companies I mentioned before are real organizations. This is not hypothetical. And there's a very simple and fundamental rhythm to it. And it's the rhythm between teams and communities. Here's what a team is. A team is any group of people who need one another to get something done. Remember years ago, one of the first times I got really enthused about what was possible in education was visiting a middle school in north of Tucson, Arizona, where they had integrated systems thinking and mental models and visioning into the whole curriculum. But more than that, into the way the teachers worked, into the way the principal interacted with everybody, into the way everybody who was part of that school kind of got caught up in the fire of learning. I imagine a few of you have been there, when everybody in a school gets caught up in the incredible fire of learning. It's just, you can't, if you've never been there, you have no idea what I'm talking about. It is like love, You either have experienced it or you haven't. And I think at some level we've all experienced it. But you kind of imagine a whole school. And it was a wonderful place. I mean, I visited an 8th grade science class. And I had gotten to know the teacher of that science class. It was very instrumental in developing a lot of systems-based learning tools that kids use throughout the school. And the first thing you noticed when you walked in the class, there was no teacher. There's no teacher. A teacher was off at the library with one of the kids. They taught the whole science curriculum on a project basis. This year, their project was to study the ecological, economic, and cultural impacts of a large national park being built on the outskirts of Tucson. That was the science curriculum. At the end of 1 month prior to the normal completion of the school year, they took tests, and they all did great in the tests. And, it was extraordinary, to watch that kind of natural learning process. By the way, the reason the teacher wasn't necessary was the kids all worked together. So they didn't need a teacher. The kids were busy working together. They had their Macintoshes, and they were actually, that day, going through a bunch of simulations they were designing to look at ecological impacts of different places where they could design the trail system in the park. It was like real stuff. The principal later told me, and the two kids, my wife and I were standing in the back, sort of hanging around, two kids saying, would you come over? We're having an argument. And they were arguing about, should they put the trails here, should they put the trails there, and da-da-da-da-da. And there was, this one, was going to be more beautiful, and it was probably preserved some ecologically delicate areas over here, which they had been studying. But it also went very close to some burial grounds, and they thought that might be a real problem. So they were living in the real world. You all know this too, all learning, learning is in life. It's not in schoolrooms. It's in the context where we have to make decisions and take action. And for them, they were really helping plan this national park. When that day was over, we were visiting with Mary Sheets, who was the principal at that time at the school. She said, oh, that was Fred and Bill who were talking to you. I walked in, I saw you talking to them. She said, those were our discipline problems. I said, what do you mean? Well, those are the two kids, you could never engage. By the way, when that subject ended that day, it was 2 o'clock, they had to go on to one last class. They were really frustrated, and they agreed they would come back at 3 and continue. And she said, I said, well, are they discipline problems now? She said, well, we don't have discipline problems now. We haven't had discipline problems in several years. None. 0. Kids don't miss school. In fact, the whole school decided to start 45 minutes early so they could have more time, and every teacher could have one block of 45 minutes a day for teacher conferences. Every day. By the way, when I've talked to teachers about that, they go, oh, I would kill for that. You mean I can actually talk to my colleagues every single day to reflect on what's going on and why Johnny is nuts? What's going on? Mary said something that really struck me, though, that day. We were talking, and I've gotten to know her quite well. She said that, the hardest thing I ever had to do was teach teachers to team. They had gradually organized the entire teaching process as teams. Because, after all, and of course, this is middle school, when a kid comes into middle school, they encounter a variety of teachers in the course of their day. Do those teachers encounter one another? Because after all, they're the different parts of that child's life. And I was very struck by that. She said it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. And she described to me some of the workshops that she led herself, which were like intense, you know, like breaking down of people's barriers. Workshops led by the principal and the assistant principal. Took over a year. She said, finally, one teacher told me, confessed, you know, she looked back about why this is so difficult. She said, well, the whole thing for me is, it's like, I'm the teacher. I'm not part of a team. And she said, you know, I remember once hearing a teacher say, when I close that door, I'm God in my universe. That's the industrial age model. That's not a teacher speaking, right? That's somebody in control of a part of the process. That's their job. They've got to get this machine to go where it's got to go. The rhythm that we've come to appreciate is a rhythm between teams, people who actually need one another to get something done, and communities. And when that rhythm exists, organizations, I believe, really learn in a meaningful sense. Because you know what? Community is not abstraction. You can touch and feel community. If you've ever lived in a real learning community, you know it. You can tell it, you can tell stories about it. Your community, though, is not just your teachers and administrators. Take this as a suggestion or the commentary of an outsider. I said at the beginning, and I did mean it, I'm not a professional educator in the same sense that you all are. I don't live in the schools. But I've, you know, had a lot of opportunity to interact with a lot of folks. And one of the things that really strikes me about the difference between school and business, I've been kind of focusing on the commonality at this very deep level of assumptions. But there are differences. School is a more complex system than work. It genuinely is. There are more fundamental boundaries across which interdependencies exist. Business people love to complain about their boards. The boards won't let them do this, and the board won't let them do this. I tell you, the board will let them do any damn thing they want as long as they make money. But your board's not like that. Your board will not let you do anything you want as long as people are learning. Will they? In fact, a lot of times, if there's too much learning going on, they tell you to slow it down, right? It's not because they're bad, it's because they represent a very complex constituency. Parents are part of your community. All the political apparatus in various ways is part of your community. But of course, there's one part that's the most neglected of all, part of your community. And in my intuitive sense, take it for what it's worth, an outsider's intuition, the key to the transformation in creating post-industrial education is to recognize who the critical players in the community are. Who are they? The kids. Where are they? I mean it, literally, I'm not being metaphorical now. Where are they? Where are they right now? Why are they not here? Why are they not part of this community? What meetings do you go to where they're there? The critical part of the community is a totally misrepresented and underrepresented. Several years ago, this will be my closing comment, I will finally end. Norman Klotz, who's here kind of doing the videotaping with his colleagues, was putting on a show that I helped organize for public broadcasting, a satellite show. And it was about transformation in schools and work. And we did something which was, I guess, really unusual. It seemed like the most obvious thing to do. We had a bunch of business people who've been very involved, and we had a bunch of people from schools who've been very involved. And the people from schools were 2 teachers and 10 kids. And we spent 3 hours on a satellite broadcast with a lot of people watching, talking. You know, just very little presentation. We just talked for about 3 hours, and it was really quite extraordinary. First hour or so, the kids were pretty quiet. Because after all, you know, these suits were over there, and you know, these big impressive companies from Ford and the steel company, and about midway, that second hour, the kids started to get more active. You see, the kids had experiences that some of the executives still didn't really understand. I mean, they were ahead in a lot of ways. And so they started laying out their understanding of what it meant to have school really work as an environment for learning. And the kids started talking about dialogue. And the kids started talking about how they learn. There was a kid there whose teacher teaches Romeo and Juliet as a systemic phenomenon, understanding the delicate web of interdependency which makes that such an archetypal story. And the kids are really turned on. By the way, this was a kid from a Mexican-American, you know, very economically depressed region in south of Tucson, expounding on the deep structural dynamics of Romeo and Juliet. It was incredible. This is not a kid who was excited about Shakespeare previously, let me tell you. I'll never forget at the end, a little girl, 12 years old or so, maybe 12 or 13, who had been quite quiet during most of the time, finally, started talking a little bit. And I showed this tape to a lot of people. I remember a good friend of mine who, a man named Ari DeHus, who was a mentor for me for many years. I showed it to him when we were in Singapore. And he looked at it and he said, those kids were so articulate, it was scary. I mean, it was like they just came out. And they started to say, you know how kids don't beat around the bushes much? Have you noticed that? They started to actually tell it like it is, and what was needed, and what they were doing, and what was working, what was not working. Very matter of fact, this little girl finally looked in the eyes of this guy from Ford, and she said, I've heard you talk a lot about how difficult this is, and how the board makes it hard, and there's a lot of, things, there's the measurement system. She said, but isn't it pretty obvious that we need to do this? Why don't you just do it? We had only a small number of criticisms come in from the viewers' feedbacks from that show. And the only one I'm aware of that came in from more than one or two people was not a lot. I think it was about 12, 15 different people wrote in with a criticism. They were teachers, and they said you let the kids talk too much. So it's us. It's not them, it's us. I mean, just look around and you can see the answer to the question. Why are the kids not here? I mean, if we're really serious about learning, why are the kids not here? Why are they never where the adults gather to figure out how to fix the future of their life? So, thank you.